Good evening. It's a very great pleasure to be here. I think I endured one of the most challenging moments of my career when, as part of the selection process for the Opera House, each of the three finalists was invited to give a lecture in this room, timed to the second of 30 minutes. And it was all part of the way in which the group selecting the architect made their final decision. So I felt very much on trial that evening. I hope I'm not so much on trial this evening. I want to talk about a theme which I think has run through our work right from the very early days, which is the concept of what might be termed the urban living room. It's something that fascinates me particularly, but I think is central to quite a lot of the work we do. It may be a slightly odd title, but I think the creation in cities and maybe elsewhere of democratic spaces where people feel at ease and at home, that are not intimidating or not difficult to gain access to, that become a focus for a city or a part of a city. That concept in urban design terms is something that I think we all feel very, very strongly about. And I think it's particularly relevant when you look at public buildings. Of course, in the 19th century, public buildings were there to impress and I think to intimidate, and were not very accessible. They had wonderful, perhaps high Victorian exteriors or neoclassical exteriors, and many of the great museums, as an example, show today the problem that that approach has. I mean, when you go to the Met in New York, or when you went to the British Museum before the Great Court, you did actually have to slightly pluck up your courage to go up the steps and enter through a sort of grand portico before gaining access to an incredible public collection. And I think it's breaking down the barriers between the outside, the inside, the public realm, that I think is very central to the work that we have done in cities. Somehow all of that started back, though, in a field. This is the Sainsbury Centre at the University of East Anglia, and perhaps was our first exploration of the living room, the urban living room. And when you look at the inside, I think it displays that strategy. This was an incredible collection given to the university by the Sainsburys of art, both contemporary and ancient. And we all very much wanted to get away from the traditional museum. As you can see, there aren't really any walls in this museum. It is all done with screens and freestanding three-dimensional objects. And the aim here was very much to create a space where people could come, they could sit on the floor, as you can see in this picture, they could draw, they could study, they could just purely enjoy the works around them. And I think this was our first exploration of democratic space. And you might say it's odd that that thesis continued in an airport, but I think, again, Stansted was quite influential in our thinking as it emerged during the late 70s and early 80s. And here we literally turned the traditional airport upside down, and that had many benefits, mainly the bringing of natural light through the roof, right the way through the building. And I think that sort of sense of calm and of sunlight and of daylight throughout the terminal is central to the idea of a space that people can enjoy. In this case, they're in transit, but it's part of a bigger picture. And then our first exercise in a real urban context. This is the city of Nîmes in the south of France, which had been under communist rule for 20 years. And then the new mayor, not a communist, had a competition which we won, for a new cultural centre in the heart of the city. This was the scene that greeted us. The site was the site of the old opera house that had burnt down in the 50s, and you can see that it was a mass of railings, of car parking, of street, and really rather depressed. And it should have been a wonderful city centre. And it was the creation of that new cultural centre that brought life back to the heart of Nîmes. In itself, it was a very accessible building. It had a diagonal public route through the middle of it. It had galleries above, a major public library in the lower levels, and a cafe at the top, which you can see with its terrace looking out over the square. So in itself, as a building on its own, it was creating that urban living room. But in fact, the repercussions of this building in terms of the public space is all too evident in this photograph. The influence of the building spread out into the square. We were responsible for re-landscaping the whole of the square, and it brought new life, new activity, and suddenly, instead of a sort of barren wilderness of cars, you had a people space where people could gather and socialize and enjoy themselves. So I think the act of regeneration through a new cultural building in the heart of Nîmes really brought the heart back to Nîmes. And that public space was not only external but internal, and the heart of the building inside is a courtyard with a great staircase that links all the levels above and below ground. And in a way, this processional route, I think, is again at the heart of the urban space. The building, of course, faces one of the great and best preserved Roman temples in existence. And that dialogue between old and new, again, is a recurring theme throughout our work. And you can see here how the building celebrates, and the space outside, all sorts of activities. There's an annual fair every year where people of Nîmes and the surroundings gather together to dance and enjoy themselves. And then moving to London, we've been working for the last nearly 20 years on the centre of London, running from Trafalgar Square at the top to the Houses of Parliament at the bottom of this image. And this has been an extraordinary voyage of trying to get the balance right, the balance between things like security and access. And what is so terrifying at the moment in the areas that we've not yet looked at but are in the process of looking at is, of course, that the Houses of Parliament are now ringed with not just one layer of concrete but two layers of concrete. So how in our contemporary society, with the threats that we all have to endure, how do you get that balance right? How do you get the balance between traffic and pedestrians right? And it's not just a question, I think, of an instant fix. It took a lot of time, a lot of research, a lot of analysis. And if we start by looking at the top of that area, Trafalgar Square, a very odd space before we got to work, where really Londoners used the outside of the square. The centre of the square was no more than a glorified traffic roundabout filled with pigeons and some poor tourists who thought they were going to enjoy themselves but actually found themselves totally surrounded by traffic. And you can see the tourists here in the right-hand top image, penned in by railings, treated much more like cattle than human beings. And in fact, it's the cars that are allowed to roam free, not the humans. So really this was a very unloved, although a sort of strong image, and of course Nelson's column is part of that. Although it has a strong image, it was a very much an unloved space. And you can see here the traffic moving around the square, very dangerous. It could take up to 9 minutes to cross from one corner of the square to the other as you fought your way through the traffic. And what we were able to achieve by taking the traffic out of the north end of the square has completely transformed the space, because now the square, the center of the square, is linked back into the infrastructure of the surrounding areas. The National Gallery has gained a handsome terrace in front of it, and the whole balance, we haven't taken all the traffic out, but the balance is now far better. And in turn, we've got rid of the pigeons, or at least the mayor is obsessed about getting rid of the pigeons, and has a partial success in doing so. But what we have created now, with the introduction of a staircase between the lower level and the upper level of the square, is a gracious space where people can sit, can meet, can walk through the space. But what I think is even more interesting is that the mayor has done a fantastic job in turning this now into the main civic space of London. All sorts of events take place there throughout the summer months. At last, London, like many European cities, has a proper outdoor space for celebrations and festivities, very much like Nîmes. And I think this, it typifies the urban living room. The urban living room doesn't have to be an indoor space, it can be an outdoor space, but this is a space that can be enjoyed by all. And as you move south through the study area, the aim at some time in the future, hopefully before the Olympics, to transform Parliament Square to provide a proper setting for the Houses of Parliament and Westminster Abbey, and again, to get the balance better between traffic and pedestrians. And then if we move up through this area, through Covent Garden to Bloomsbury, we come to the British Museum. And the British Museum, as I said, was a very stern and quite intimidating building. And you did have to pluck up your courage to go. An incredible collection inside, but not the most welcoming of museums. And at the heart of that museum, a courtyard. And a courtyard that had originally been the heart of the museum, an open space where you could wander and talk about the collections inside the museum. But that space only existed for 10 years before the architect's brother, who was highly competitive with his brother, built in the courtyard the round reading room. And then once the round reading room, which was a library of reference, was established, it grew a whole range of bookstack buildings, which you can see in the top photograph around the round reading room. So the courtyard was lost, and the British Museum lost its heart. And what we were able to do was to take away the bookstack buildings, which were destroyed during the war and rebuilt after the war, and were of no architectural consequence when the library moved out to its new premises. And by doing that and raising the floor of the courtyard, we were able to establish the courtyard back again as an unfound or an unloved space as it had previously been. It was now discovered at the heart of the museum. And then, of course, because we don't enjoy the Dallas climate and weather in London is more like the weather it has been here today, we enclosed that courtyard with a lightweight roof to provide a new urban space at the heart of the museum. And you can see that in a little bit more detail. And this was the view that greeted us halfway through construction, where we were taking down those bookstack buildings and building the new floor level that ran through, and the slightly intimidating task of maintaining the round reading room, which is a very delicate structure. And the other problem that we faced was that there was no access to the site, and nearly 5 million visitors a year were visiting the museum throughout the construction process. So everything had to be craned in or craned out. And that was the transformation a few months later that we were able to realize with its roof, its new floor, the round reading room clad and the staircase taking you to the upper levels of the museum. And this is a space that is open for much longer hours than the museum, and part of the money that was given towards it was on condition that it became a public space, not just the center of the museum. So this is a walk-through. You can walk right the way through the museum as a link between Covent Garden and Bloomsbury. And this space, like any working urban space, is used for all sorts of different activities, educational, entertainment, parties, and so on. And it does represent the center of the museum. What I think people don't understand is that below that level, there are all sorts of new facilities for school children, for education, for seminars, and new galleries for the African collection, which came as part of the bigger project. And as you look across London from St. Paul's, you can see the roof of the British Museum on the left there, below the post office tower, glowing at night. And then beyond, the arch of the new Wembley Stadium. And the stadium opened, had its first public match just 5 days ago, last Saturday. This is the view of the building from closer to. And here is the interior of the new 90,000-seater stadium. And this was a sort of warm-up match about a fortnight ago. And in a way, this too, I think, falls under the title of a meeting space, a coming together of people, and trying again not to make this a pompous occasion, but one of celebration and enjoyment. But linking back to the centre of London, the work that we did for the Millennium Bridge that links St. Paul's with the new Tate Modern, the Museum of Modern Art in London, and some of the analytical work that we've done on many of our projects, including Trafalgar Square and the bridge, to show, when you study the movement of pedestrians, how by getting the routing right, and in this case opening up this river link, you actually enhance and encourage regeneration and movement in new parts of London. And of course the South Bank, this part of the South Bank, was very run down before the Tate Modern arrived and before the bridge was built. And you can see here a detail of that bridge. It floats across the Thames. It's a very slender, delicate structure just for pedestrians that makes the most minimum visual impact in what is a sensitive historic area. And as you move across that bridge from St. Paul's towards Tate Modern on the South Bank, the impact that that bridge has had has been quite extraordinary, not only in terms of helping to open up Tate Modern and get people to Tate Modern, but very interestingly, the impact it's had on St. Paul's, and the visitors have increased to St. Paul's by 40%, an extraordinary increase to what was already a very popular tourist and religious destination. And if you then went up onto the terrace of Tate Modern and looked back across the river, you can see St. Paul's and the bridge on the left. Towards the right of this picture, you can see the new silver clouds of a project that we have been doing with Jean Nouvel. We've formed a joint venture, Jean and ourselves, and we've been working on this new quarter in the city of London. This is not a high-rise development, it's a low-rise piece of urban, very important urban infill. And on the right of this picture, the slab blocks are halfway up the picture, is the site, a building that was rebuilt after the war, a rather boring 60s building, which our client, the owners of the building, wanted Jean and ourselves to redevelop. And the problem with the site as it now is that you cannot penetrate it. It's a sort of wall and you can't walk through it. And if you go back to the medieval street pattern in the City of London, you can see the diagonal route cutting through the site, which was the original Roman street of Watling Street. And the site was far more accessible. There were all sorts of alleys and roads that moved through the site. So we felt it was very important to go back and look at history and re-establish that access and to open up the site. So you can see Watling Street in the same location moving through the site, the creation of a new public square, a new public living room, if you like, an outdoor space for everybody to use, and then various alleyways and routes that lead from that square north and south. So suddenly the site is now accessible. And then the other thing that we've done, which is very much against the norm in the city, is to open up the whole of the ground floor to retail. Again, a public facility, instead of the normal, rather pompous entrances to office buildings. And we've limited the access to the offices above to the absolute minimum. So again, one's looking at tipping the balance between the private realm and the public realm to get life and activity and movement at ground level. And this then shows close to the really quite gentle way in which the new building sits in its context. And it has a base plinth which responds to the existing buildings around it. And then as you move through into the square, the drama of the clouds, the shapes that sit above that datum, erupt and move you upwards and vertically. So there's a very strong presence in the square, and of course these higher buildings are what you saw from the terrace of Tate Modern. So they represent the sort of marker in the city of this new quarter. And in a way, that takes us back to the Commerzbank, a project I worked on in the office in the mid-90s, and was an exploration of an ecological, a sustainable high-rise building. It happens to be the highest building even now in Europe, but its particular feature is that every single office in that building is naturally ventilated. And this has been a very interesting relationship between ourselves and the client, and we are on very good terms with the Commerzbank, and we get a lot of very positive feedback. So that when we did the original studies on this project, we said that you'd probably only be able to open the windows for 60% of the year, because for the remaining 40% it would be too hot, too cold, or too windy. But the feedback from the Commerzbank, and this is absolutely bang up to date, is that in fact the windows are actually opened by the people working there 80% of the year. And of course that has a huge impact on the energy bill for the building, because there isn't a massive amount of air conditioning being pumped around the building. It's a naturally ventilated building with the necessary heating and cooling provided in a far more economical way than air conditioning. And to achieve that ventilation, we introduced 9 gardens that spiral around the building, and they act both as a social space where people come to talk and to meet, as you can see here, but also as an integral part of the ventilation system. But in terms of the subject of this evening, what I think is particularly interesting is the way the base of the building is treated, where the tower, which is on the right of this photograph, comes down to ground, and we created an enclosed public plaza, which is both art gallery and eating place, not only for the Commerzbank, but for the people of Frankfurt. And it's part of a cut-through that links one part of Frankfurt to another. So again, taking the traditional brief for a high-rise, where the canteen might have been somewhere up the building, by bringing that down to ground level and making it a public facility, you change the whole experience of a high-rise building. And then if you come back to London, this was the site after it had been cleaned up when the IRA bombed the Baltic Exchange in the 80s. And the remains of the historic exchange you can see in the middle. And after much discussion, it was agreed that really this building had had its day and that a new building could be built on the site. And so we were appointed to look at that building, and the building that arose you probably have seen quite often, quite heavily illustrated, the Swiss Re building. And this building was very much designed as a continuity from the Commerzbank. It's about natural ventilation, getting light deep into the heart of the building, and it's a highly sustainable building. But what is interesting also about it is the top and the bottom, and the way in which the building is shaped allowed us at the top of the building, instead of creating a glorified center for all the mechanical plant, which is the norm at the top of most high-rise buildings. Instead, this is the restaurant and bar and meeting place for the people working in the building, enjoying fantastic views out across London and beyond. And then again, because of the shape, the way the building tucks in at the bottom, we were able to create much more public space. So suddenly in this part of London, and of course the city is very dense, we were able to create a major urban space at the base of Swiss Re. So again, that reiterates the breakdown of the norm and creating new spaces, both internal and external, for everybody to enjoy. And then moving here to the States, the recently completed Hearst building. In the 20s, the Hearst built their headquarters and had always planned to build a high-rise, a tower, at the center of their building. But they didn't get around to it for 70 or 80 years, and we were then commissioned to look at that challenge, to keep the historic base, to make better use of the historic base. The historic base was very, very limited because of the floor-to-ceiling heights of the offices and accommodation at the base, and to transform it with a new building. So this was the high-rise that emerged out of that base with its very distinctive triangulated structure. And the way in which that building comes down to ground level and the creation of a major courtyard at the base of the building behind the historic facade, which then becomes the social meeting space for the people working there and the entrance into the building, was central to the design approach. And you can see that space here. Unfortunately, on the left, I'm sorry I haven't got a photograph of it, is the Richard Long installation with the escalators going down to ground level through the waterfall. And then the creation of this major space, a little like the Commerzbank, at the elevated level, with the retention of the facade seen from the inside of the historic building. And really, as a sort of reminder that as part of the regeneration that many of these projects have shown, and the way in which we address public space, you can't divorce that from the issue of sustainability. The two are totally interlinked. What is good for regeneration, what is good for a city, is often extraordinarily good for sustainability. And really, the work that we've done on sustainability, again, goes back to the beginning and moves through many of the projects that I'm talking about this evening. And this year is our 40th anniversary, and I think this is a very important theme through our work. No more so than in North Germany, in the city of Duisburg, where the city went into serious decline in the 70s. The steel and coal industry collapsed. And at the heart of the city, this inner harbour off the Rhine, which was a sort of derelict, unloved waterway with no use and very few buildings that were of public use around it, and all of this in decay. And this is a story of working with a city for now 20 years. We started work in 1987. And I think it's been a very interesting journey over those last 20 years. We won the competition for a building that I'll come to in just a minute, but a lot of the work that we've been doing with the city is very, very small scale. On the right, you can just see the pontoon that we designed, which enabled tour boats to take a trip around the inner harbour and go out onto the Rhine, which was previously not possible. So this very small intervention created a tourist attraction. And then the introduction at right angles to the inner harbour of canals that stretch away from the inner harbour, that allow areas, that open up areas that are nice to look at, nice to walk around, and where new housing and new offices can be created. And in turn, not only ourselves but other architects have restored what few historic buildings were left after the war. So this very gradual process of regeneration has, I think, been very beneficial. And that's included housing, which you can see here, again, quite small scale, infill into the urban fabric. But the project on which we won the competition, you can see here in this montage, was a crescent building, and it's, I suppose, fairly typical of master planning for cities, that the major gesture is always the most difficult to achieve, and we've just been commissioned to come back to this building some 20 years later to actually move it forward into construction. And that building will be state-of-the-art, a sustainable building using a considerable array of photovoltaic on its main facade, which you can see here. Meanwhile, back in the city centre, some years ago, we built a number of, as it were, sort of test buildings that allowed the city to begin to move away from its previous manufacturing position to one of microtechnology. So these sort of pioneering buildings helped the city to change its image. But then, 6 months ago, the city came back to us and said, will we now expand our master planning to look at the city at large? And this is the city at large as it is today. And this is the recently launched master plan, which again is part of a gradual evolution, and in the bigger picture, the opportunity of taking the main railway station, which you can see on the bottom right of the picture, as a point of regeneration, a new start, and looking at strengthening the main shopping street, which you can see in yellow, the introduction of landscape, and a few new buildings. And you can see how that then in turn relates to the inner harbour and the Rhine to the north. Keeping with a watery theme, this is our project for the Sage and Gateshead, and this is important in terms of the Opera House here in Dallas. This picture appeared on the front of the Times. I wasn't certain whether it was a compliment or not, but I'll take it as such. This is very much a project of regeneration. The Tyne River, Newcastle, it was a major centre of the coal industry, very like Duisburg. Newcastle is at the bottom of the picture, and to the south, to the top of the picture, was Gateshead, which has always been a sort of very much a poor relation to Newcastle. Between the two is the River Tyne, with the great bridges, the Tyne bridges that go across the gorge. And we were asked to look at, having won a competition, to look at the site in Gateshead facing the river. And this is how the site appeared when we started the project. It was totally desolate, nothing happened there. And on the left you can see the Baltic flour mill, which was built in the 20s, which became Newcastle and Gateshead's equivalent to Tate Modern. The building was converted into a contemporary arts centre. We selected, after much debate with the client, the site in yellow that you can see on the right. And our strategy was to construct a new art centre, cultural art centre, performing arts centre on the site, which was very much part of a route that linked down to, on the left, the new arts centre, down to the quayside on the right, across an existing bridge and back round a new bridge, to make a loop, and the loop actually goes through the building. And that building, again, becomes a new urban living room for the community in Gateshead. And you can see the building here, sitting above the river with its very strongly modelled roof, which encompasses and encloses the three halls directly beneath. A detail looking through the Tyne Bridge. The Tyne Bridge was the model for the Great Sydney Bridge. And then the building here from the side. And then as you move into the building, all the performance spaces are lifted up above the principal entry level. And the entry level becomes a public space. And again, like the British Museum, this space is open throughout the day. And people come here just to have a cup of tea or to meet their friends, independent of the performances that are taking place in the three performance spaces a level up. And from this space, they have fantastic views across the river to Newcastle to the north. And this, by night, shows the heart of the building, a cafe and restaurant and shops, with then the staircases taking people up to the major performance space on the left and the minor space on the right, with the rehearsal hall straight ahead. And the major hall is a concert hall for 1650 people. The smaller hall is for 400, and the rehearsal hall is the main performance space for the School of Music, which is tucked in below the principal floor level. And you can see here the new major concert hall. It follows the sort of classic shoebox form of the Musikverein in Vienna and many other of the great concert halls, including the Märzen here in Dallas. And in fact, the acoustic consultant who's working with us on the Opera House worked with us on this and also worked on the Märzen. So there's a very strong link tying together this building, the Märzen, and the Opera House. And this performs both for classical music and folk music, all kinds of music. And then the small hall is a centralized form, much more intimate, more smoky, and suitably dark in its coloring, which you can see here, very flexible hall. And then the rehearsal hall, which is, as I said, the main performance space for the students. And you can see that in full swing here. And then you go down below that main concourse level, and this is the circulation space for the school itself, again with fantastic views out across the river. And that leads me to another regeneration, another piece of restoration and bringing new life back to an old building. This building actually only built at the end of the 50s and the beginning of the 60s by Candelis and his team for the Free University in Berlin. And they experimented with using core 10 as the cladding material. Unfortunately, the core 10 has not survived, as you can see in this photograph. And so part of our commission was the recladding of the original Candilis building. But there was also the demand for new space, and that in the form of a major new library. And if you look down on the original Free University complex, there was a courtyard which was not really used for anything, and the idea was then to occupy that courtyard by a new enclosure that made the new library for the Free University. And that enclosure is a lightweight enclosure that allows natural light and ventilation to come into the building. And you can see then the view of the new library by night, and the pattern of solid to glazed panels. And then this is the view as you come in from the courtyard into this new enclosure. A relatively calm and simple external envelope with then a series of terraces inside the building which form the platforms for the library itself, with all the book stacks at the heart and the reading spaces around the perimeter of those floating planes, with obviously then all the vertical movement, as you can see, in the middle. And this shows the way in which the book stacks to the reading space work, but the performance of the external envelope in terms of its natural ventilation, the way in which solar shading is provided, the acoustic treatment, and so on. So this is, again, like so many of our projects, deeply sustainable in terms of its performance and energy consumption. And staying in Germany and looking at a form of a roof which has some similarities, this is the restoration of the Dresden railway station that we completed at the end of last year. And that building has been completely re-enclosed, if that's a word, in order to get back to the quality of the original. So if we look at this photograph of the very handsome original turn of the century, 19th century station, a quite complex building that exists on two principal levels, the middle being at a low level and the sides for through trains at a higher level. And after the war, it was, of course, Dresden was totally obliterated by the Allied bombing on the 13th of February 1945. The station was the only historic building that survived in any form whatsoever. And after the war, the regime then in power sort of restored the station. But their way of restoration was somewhat peculiar, because they took to covering up whatever they could in the most simple and most basic of ways. So the original dome was covered in roofing felt, which you can see here, and all the stonework, which had been damaged but not destroyed, was refaced with a very sort of plain and dreary light stone, which you can see at the base of the front elevation. So really the essence of the original building was completely lost. And we've now transformed that back, not exactly to the original, because again, that doesn't really fit in the way we approach historic buildings. But we've taken off all the 50s stone. The stonework now is partially restored, but you can still see the damage that was done during the war. All the geometry is restored. There is new glazing to the railway sheds on the left and the right. And now the cupola is back to nearly its original form, but is now glazed in a contemporary idiom. Everybody thinks that we've designed this dome from scratch, but all the structure survived the war and is the original structure inside the dome. And all that we have done is put a simple glass enclosure to get back to the original form of that dome. And you can see that dome in more detail here. And again, this is part of the ventilation strategy for the concourse beneath. This was the main railway shed inside the building, the principal space, a wonderful Victorian arch structure, very delicate arch structure. After the Allied bombers had passed over Dresden, this was the state of the station, and as you can see, the structure survived, even if the cladding of the roof was destroyed. And this is what the post-war regime did to the station, completely altered the character of it, and did little to respect the original design. And we felt that it was then important to think about the original design, but perhaps to interpret that in a contemporary way. So all the structure was restored, but instead of going back to the original roof cladding, we covered the whole of that roof in a Teflon-coated fabric, so that the whole of the roof glows on an even basis and offsets the Victorian structure of the principal arches. And you can see the detail of that wonderful 1890 structure here, with then the sort of very recessive, lightweight cladding above. And that form has some relationship to the work that is nearly complete at the Smithsonian, the new National Portrait Gallery in Washington, where we were asked to look at the central courtyard of the National Portrait Gallery, not the whole of the building. That was being done by others. And the desire here to create a new social space for Washington. The National Portrait Gallery is the third oldest building in Washington and was where Lincoln held his inaugural balls. And that space really had been lost for that sort of use. And now there's a great demand to create a new sort of party space, a new social space for Washington. And so the idea to cover that with an undulating roof, but completely different from the British Museum, because the use of this courtyard is different. The British Museum is really an Italian piazza. This is a space for eating in, for drinking in, for meeting in. And so the acoustics are very important. And this led to the form of the roof, which is a sort of, in a way, a bent egg crate with some depth to it. And we're able, by doing that, to get as much acoustic performance out of the roof as equivalent to laying the whole of the floor in carpet. So we get a very considerable amount of acoustic absorption in the roof structure, because the rest of the space is totally hard and stone. And this shows a montage working with Catherine Gustafson from Seattle on the landscape, which was an important feature of the original courtyard, to create a space that will be used for many social events in Washington. And you can see the sort of armadillo-like plated structure of the glazing and the structure underneath in this recent construction shot. But again, creating that democratic space, that urban living room, in this case for Washington. And in a different way, the master plan for the Museum of Fine Art in Boston, where the whole point of the strategy is to get back to the original master plan, which was all about a central axis from Huntington Avenue through the building to the Fens, with the principal entrances on that axis. And that had been diluted in the 20th century with new entrances added to the west. So very much going back to the historic origins and restoring that master plan, but at the same time looking at the courtyards, which were somewhat underused in the current configuration, and seeing whether in a different way, again from both the Smithsonian and from the British Museum, by partially enclosing those courtyards, creating again, a new central space for the museum. And in this case, there is external landscape between the historic building that makes the courtyard and, as it were, a glass box that is dropped into the courtyard as a completely independent element. And courtyards and spaces and this idea of space continues in the project that we're doing in St. Petersburg on New Holland Island. This is an extraordinary complex of historic buildings that were built by Peter the Great to store his wood in whilst he was building his great naval fleet in the 18th century. And those buildings have survived, and you can see them both on the left and top right. And the island more recently was a prison, and the building on the bottom right is a circular early 19th century prison building. The whole thing was then taken over by the Russian military at the turn of the 20th century and has been out of use or forbidden entry ever since, but it's now been turned back to the people of St. Petersburg. And it's right next door to the Mariinsky, the Kirov Opera, which is to the bottom left of this drawing, and very close to the main harbour and the river. And at the heart of this triangular complex is an inner harbour where the boats were built before they were launched in the harbour. And our strategy to restore the original Peter the Great buildings, to take away the more recent buildings that were of no value on the third side of that triangle, and then using culture again as a regenerating force to create a new concert hall for a whole range of different activities, a festival hall at the heart of the inner harbour. And you can see the triangulated form, the two wings of that concert hall stretching out to embrace that inner harbour. And the surrounding restored buildings and the new buildings on the right being much needed hotels, which St. Petersburg is very short of, and retail and cafe and restaurant life, and a new gallery and a new small performance space in the prison. And this again shows the form of that, and underneath the triangulated peak of the roof sits the enclosure of the new concert hall. But again, this will create a new urban space in this quarter of St. Petersburg, again, a popular outdoor space. And now, just to end on, but just is not the right word, of course, coming here to Dallas, and we'll go over the road in just a minute and look at the models. But the work that we've so enjoyably been doing over the last few years on the Opera House, which is a project that's extraordinarily close to my heart because I'm a sort of opera fanatic. And I think the amazing opportunity that the whole of this project offers Dallas. Already you have an extraordinary concert hall in the form of the Marson. And I'm now talking about the performing arts. The visual arts are so incredibly well served by this building and the new Nasher Center. But on the performing side, when this is complete, you will have an opera house, you will have a new theatre, you will have a wonderful concert hall, and of course there's the Booker T School, which I think is such a crucial part of the whole project. And then in time to come, the third venue, which will occupy the green site on the bottom right of this plan. And I think each of those buildings, in their own way, will set new standards across the world. What I think is equally exciting is the opportunity of the interrelationship between those facilities. Because we've seen at the Sage and Gateshead how having those three different performance spaces, in this case under one roof with the school, what the opportunities are for mixing and matching between all those functions. And I think here in Dallas you have that opportunity on a far greater scale than Gateshead. And I think the way in which things can be programmed between the different facilities, the opportunities that that offers, I think are going to be second to none. And then if you thread through all of this, Michel Devine's landscape and the creation of a greatly enhanced artist square with the opportunities during the fall and during the spring and during the summer for outdoor performances. And then you think about that space being shaded from the sun by an extended solar canopy that stretches out from the Opera House. There is an opportunity here which I think will be truly amazing. And that's more about the way in which the buildings get used than the buildings themselves. Obviously the buildings are important, but the way those buildings, the opportunities those buildings offer, I think is very exciting. This shows the diagrammatic cross-section through the Opera House, the auditorium of the Opera House and its 3 stages behind are the core of the building, and that forms a very strong central visual focus for the whole building. And as you will see in just a minute, on the outside, that's clad in a very dramatic way. And then stretching out from that core is this solar canopy, which in part provides the roof for the lobby spaces, the public spaces at the front of the building, and the offices and dressing rooms at the rear of the building. But it then becomes more delicate, more open to provide solar shading for both the building itself and the public space beneath. And you can see on the left, beneath the ground, the car park that is already well constructed that provides the necessary parking for people coming to performances in the district. And as I've said, that solar canopy is all about the performance of the building to create a more benign climate directly beneath it, really going back to traditional shading techniques, which I think have been so extensively lost across the world, wherever you go. And everybody has retreated to air conditioning as the sort of simple fix, but very unecological fix for temperature control. But looking back to techniques that were developed in ages gone by, which, when linked with water, the use of water and landscape, provide a microclimate adjacent to the Opera House, and of course assist in the performance, the energy performance of the Opera House itself. And this shows the view. We're standing with your back to Rem's new theatre, which is behind us, looking across Flora Street towards the Opera House with the solar canopy providing that shading. And the drum of the Opera House clad in red glass, so it's a celebration of opera, it's a visual focal point for the performing arts district. And as you move closer, this diagrammatic elevation shows the way in which you'll move up to the various levels of the Opera House. There is a staircase, and a staircase is as much about going up and coming down as it is about talking and meeting friends and socializing. That staircase links the various lobby spaces as they move from one side of the drum to the other, and eventually bring you to the top level of the Opera House itself. And this shows the base of that staircase when you've come into the building, and it zigzags across the drum in a very informal way. And then cut into the drum, as sort of gouges out of the fabric of the drum, are the horizontal circulation routes that link one side of the auditorium to another. And then as you move through this picture to the distance, you arrive at the cafe, which is at the ground level, and again celebrating the weather, when the weather is really quite benign in the fall and in the spring, the opportunity of completely getting rid of the external wall. So the whole of the glass wall lifts up, so you'll be able to move freely between the inside and the outside, and sit outside under the canopy in the shade throughout the day. And the restaurant, which is directly above the cafe, has the same facility, and you can see here on the left the way in which the glass wall has lifted up so that people dining or lunching here will be sitting quasi out of doors. And again, taking benefit of the climate, which I know is extremely hot in the summer, but during the other months can actually be extremely pleasant. So this ability to move the indoor and the outdoor and to blur the edges, I think, again, central to our overall thesis of creating not a terrifying building where you feel you have to knock at the door and enter a grand temple of culture, but a much more democratic building that allows people to come and enjoy the building and the performances in the building simultaneously. The inside of the auditorium is unashamedly based on historic precedent, and the great opera houses of the 19th century used the horseshoe form, which you can see here in Munich as an example auditorium. It'll house 2,200 people, which is exactly the same as the Royal Opera House at Covent Garden. And you can see the way in which the inside is stacked vertically with its various levels, and the way in which the horseshoe form, the plan form, envelops the proscenium arch, so that everybody is drawn into the action on stage. And then if we turn around and look in the other direction from the stage, you can see the curved form that finds its way up into the ceiling, which echoes the same oval shape. And then an opportunity that we're looking at the moment for a very dramatic chandelier that drops down during the interval or before the performance or after the performance, and then is pulled up and disappears in the ceiling above during the performance. And this will be the visual focus of the whole of the auditorium. And that red theme will continue in one form or another into the auditorium itself. The colours are something that we are studying very much at the moment. So that's just a little snapshot of the Opera House, and we can go and look at models if we can brave the weather now. Thank you very much.